2.5 years ago, I took my daughter to her first Ren Fair and she fell in love. There was something about it. Being outside, all the pretty costumes, lots of things to see and do, and of course the shopping. She just absolutely fell in love with the atmosphere. For me, it wasn't really my era. It wasn't one that I had done a whole lot of study in or had a whole lot of interest in the costumes. But at the same time, it would offer a chance for her and I to bond, to get out of the house and do something together. And I thought that was more than worth it. Bonus to that, some of my friends were already a part of a guild, so it was very easy to sit down with them and see about joining and getting started. I had just started my sewing journey, and while I'd had a lot of experience with making quilts and making various things with sewing, I didn't have a whole lot of experience with making period costumes. My guild was great. They set us up with a lot of information, some fabric, patterns, and books to get us started. But unfortunately, we didn't live close by. I live out in the middle of nowhere, and so I didn't have someone to come over and hold my hand to make sure I didn't make any ridiculous mistakes when making our costumes. As a result, my first attempts, while wearable and adorable, didn't meet the needs that we had for dressing a small child in a Ren Fair costume. Because kids grow, they need a costume that is going to grow with them if you want for them to wear it for longer than a season. The following are a list of don'ts that I made with my first attempts in the hopes that you won't make the same mistakes that I did. Don't make a fitted chemise. I know it's very easy to go onto elizabethancostumes.com, put in the measurements, and have a pattern pop out. But if you make a chemise that is fitted in the sleeves and fitted in through the body, they're only going to be able to wear it for a season, possibly even less, before you have to make another one. Along the same lines, don't hand sew anything for a children's costume. The first thing they're going to do when you get there is put a stain in it. You're not going to know where the stain came from or why it won't come out, but the first thing they're going to do is put in that stain. That's what kids do. The next one is one that I learned the hard way. Don't make a circle skirt. You're given two options when it comes to making the skirts. The first one, the rectangle, and the next one where they take the rectangle and cut it at the angle so you're able to get a nice flared hem and less bulk at the waistband. This is great for an adult's costume, but for a child, you're going to want to put a chunky hem at the bottom so that they can be let out and grow into it later. If you do a circle skirt like that, you're going to have a lot of problems putting that chunky hem in there. It is not going to work, and you're going to end up with creases and puckers and all kinds of problems. Just do a regular rectangle skirt and keep it simple. The next is one that I still struggle with to this day. Do not assume that their skirts are going to stay up. Children at this age are little rectangles, and it's very common for things to not want to stay up on their waist, especially when they're wiggling and running and having a great time. And these skirts are a little heavy, so they're going to start sliding down. I tried a bunch of different things the first time around to get these skirts to stay up. I tried using suspenders. Unfortunately, the suspenders showed. I tried sewing the suspenders into the bodice so that they wouldn't show. They just snapped right off the suspenders. I tried putting little ties, little ribbons sewn into the bodice and sewn into the skirt so I could tie them together. They ripped. I tried little snaps and to snap them in. They unsnapped. Nothing was keeping these skirts up. I had hoped that this time, since she was a little bit older, we would have less trouble with her skirt staying up. No. I'll come back to that later. The last one is the most important, and that is to make a bodice that will grow with them. The first bodice I made was just a simple rectangle with simple rectangle straps. And while it served its purpose and it looked good, within a season she had outgrown it and it needed to be unmade. So for this one, I'm taking a note out of my bodice and putting seams along the side as well as along the front so that the bodice is able to grow as she does, and it won't be until either the gaps become too wide or the bodice is too short that I'll have to make another one. Hopefully, this one will last just a little bit longer. With those things in mind, I got started with sewing. First, I needed to make a chemise. Making this chemise is actually fairly simple and mess-up proof. I know, I tried to mess it up and I was still able to salvage it and make it work. What you're going to need is a lightweight cotton, a single fold bias tape, elastic, and some thin ribbon for tying in the front. I actually ended up making 2 chemises so she could have one for each day without having to wash them in between. And each one was very simple, and it took me a couple hours to make them. First one, of course, is when I made most of my mistakes because I wasn't paying close enough attention, and yet it still came out wearable and in good condition. So clearly, even I couldn't mess this up. I started off with the book that my mentors had given me. That is a great book for when you're just getting started and need some basic direction on where to go for making Ren Faire costumes, even for making children's Ren Faire costumes. Elizabethan Costumes for the Years 1550 through 1580 by Janet Wagner and Carolyn Savoy. This is a great book to have to get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is figure out the measurements. In the book, they give you the dimensions and measurements for when you're making one for an adult, but not the ones for a child. So this is going to take a little bit of guesswork. The first one, measurement, not so much. You will need the measurement from their shoulder down to the top of their foot, and then add 6 inches so you can have that chunky hem in there. The next one was for wide. You start with the shoulder to shoulder, and then you kind of guess from there. I started off with double the shoulder width, and then was like, it still doesn't seem full enough, so I added in another half length, and finally rounded that to about 30 inches, and decided, yeah, that looks close enough. And that really was what it is, I just guessed. That's the best you could do at that point. With those measurements cut out for the body, it was then on to the sleeve, and yet more measurements. I had the measurement for her bicep, and had the measurement from her shoulder to her hand, which the shoulder to hand was an easy measurement to start off with, but how wide do you want to make it? Hence the puffy sleeves, so that they have a little bit of room to grow into. I started with her measurements, just kept growing until I finally just guessed a number that looked about right. Really, it was just a lot of guessworks on the measurements and numbers until it looked about right. But it's incredibly hard to mess up. Even if it comes out a little bit small, it's still going to look great. Because in this case, small just means not so puffy. Just fine. With rectangles cut out for the arms and rectangles for the bodice, it was time to get to the real nitty-gritty of making this chemise. According to the directions in the book, you want to take the fabric for the bodice section of the chemise and fold it in half. Then take both of the sleeves, fold it in half, lay it on top of each other, and lay them into the corner of the chemise. And the measurements in the book are for an adult, where you have the sleeves 3 inches above the bodice, body, and 3 inches in, but that looked a little bit too big considering I was scaling it down for a child's size, so I just moved it around until it looked about right and called it a day. From there, I followed the directions to make cuts into the chemise for making the neckline, as well as making the seam where the arms and the body of the chemise fit together. Once that is done, it's a matter of taking it to the sewing machine and connecting all the pieces. Starting with the upper parts of the arms, connecting them to the body, and then sewing from the hem all the way out to the sleeves, or vice versa. From there, all it needed was this nice chunky hem, a small hem along the sleeve with elastics in the waistband, make a little bit of a ruffle. Yes, elastic, I got permission to put that in there because you don't want children fussing with strings dangling like that. It's going to be too much of a hassle. Also, I used a single fold bias tape in order to sew it along the neckline and put in a simple ribbon to gather that all up down to size. It came out a lot better than I thought it was going to. I used my serger to sew the seams up together, but it's so forgiving that you can use whatever finishing seams is your preference. You can use French seams, you can use flat felt seams, you can use pinking shears. It's very forgiving in what decisions you choose and on how to finish this. From there, I began on her outer garments, starting with her skirt. I bought a pink cotton corduroy and got it approved by my guild for being accurate enough in order to pass the test. But what I made a very simple rectangular skirt measuring from her waist to the floor, plus 6 inches for that big chunky hem, sewing it up salvage to salvage, and then putting in a simple waistband. I used leftovers from the white chemise in order to make the waistband so that there would be less bulk than if I had used the bulky corduroy fabric. Finally, it was time to make her bodice. I had just made my bodice the week before, so it was still fresh in my mind, and I had a pretty good idea of the way I wanted to go about it and adjustments I wanted to make just to make it easier to sew. But overall, it was the same process, and if you want to see more in depth, check out last week's video. The first thing I needed was a pattern, but I couldn't really find any patterns for children's bodices. So I went down to the local thrift shop that specialized, it seemed, in 80s patterns, which never seemed to move because who needs 80s patterns? But while I was there, I happened upon a pattern for a children's vest, and that was exactly what I needed. Paid my 25 cents, and I had my starting point for her chemise. Upon going through this pattern, I found that the only difference between what she needed for her bodice and this pattern were the points, whereas hers needed to come to a single point in the center and theirs had 2 points along the front. That was a very simple adjustment that I was able to make and move along towards making her first mock-up. Next thing I did is I used my good friend Tippy here to fit the mock-up to and make sure that it was going to fit on her. Surprisingly, it fit very well the first time and only needed taking in a little bit along the sides and some of the length adjusted. But overall, it was a very good fit. If you don't have a children's size mannequin, you can of course fit it on your child. It's a lot easier than fitting it on yourself. Just make sure that you're very careful with the pins and that you don't have a child that's very fiddly or uncomfortable with things being fitted onto them, in which case having the mannequin is a very good thing. I'm fortunate that this mannequin is very close to her in measurements, and as she grows I'll just be able to add a little bit of padding in order to keep those measurements accurate. So for now this is working out for me very well. Now that I had a mock-up that was fitted properly, I was able to cut that up and put it onto wrapping paper to make a clean pattern. That pattern was then used to cut out the outer fabric, the lining, and the stabilizer. Now for my last one, I used fusible interfacing for the stiffening layer in between, but I didn't really want to do that with hers. I wanted to try using a duck cloth to see about having that sturdier, hardier fabric in there. She doesn't get hot as easily as I do, so I knew that extra layer would be okay for her, and I wanted that extra layer of strength considering how hard she is on her clothes. So I cut out the outer layer and the lining as well as the duck cloth inner lining and realized the prime truth that we all learn at one point: do not sew when you're tired. I made that mistake and I cut out the inner lining and forgot to add in seam allowance, which is kind of an important thing to have. Thankfully, I was able to salvage it in the end because I didn't have enough fabric left over to cut out another one, but I was able to make it work, fortunately. Now that everything was cut out, I was able to sew up the sew the outer fabric to the lining using the inner facing and the outer fabric as if they were one fabric. I folded and pressed those right sides out. And sewed in the boning channels. Inserted the grommets. And I was able to have my first fitting, which that went fairly well. So I added the bias tape and used zip ties for the boning. Once I put on the bottom binding and added in the lacing, the bodice was finished. So with that, her costume was ready to wear just in time for the Highland Games. It turned out adorable. I was really proud of it. And of course, as always, her costumes always turn out better than mine. Here are a few clips from the Highland Games so you can see how well it turned out. She received a lot of compliments for her costume and for being as adorable as she is. But one of the mistakes I found that I had made was I once again underestimated those skirts staying up. I had thought I had made the elastic tight enough and that the bodice was snug enough that it would keep the skirts up. Not true. We spent the entire time shoving those skirts back up her bodice and they would not stay up. So, with another Ren Fair coming up, I needed to make sure I put a stop to those falling skirts once and for all. I took some fabric left over from when I was making my bodice and made tubes to make a fabric suspender. I took Tippy here and put on the bodice and put tape around the arms and neck holes so I would know where they would need to fit so that they would stay underneath the bodice and not show. From there, I put on the skirts and pinned the straps to the skirts and sewed them down. Ren Fair is coming up here real soon, so we'll see if this time her skirts will actually stay up. Here's hoping. So with that, it is time to clean my sewing space so I can get started on the next project. Until next time!